Stepdaughter tried to kick me out of my own home to buy a big house for her family. I guess I should start with how things were before all this nonsense began. I met Laura, my late wife, about 30-something years ago, and she already had a little girl named Sarah. Sarah was only 2 back then, and I didn't think twice about stepping into a father role for her. Laura and I didn't have kids together, but that didn't make Sarah any less my kid. I loved her like my own, and when Laura passed away in that accident, it felt like my whole world flipped upside down. Sarah was just a teenager at that time, but even then, I knew I'd do whatever it took to keep her safe and secure. I worked as a high school English teacher, which didn't exactly make me rich, but it was steady, and I loved the work. Laura used to joke that I had the patience of a saint, and honestly, being an only parent after she passed meant I'd need every ounce of it. Those first few years after losing Laura were tough, but Sarah and I got through them together. She'd help me in the kitchen, we'd watch movies, go camping. It wasn't easy, but we made it work. Sarah was bright too. I thought she'd go far, maybe become a lawyer or something big like that. So, when she turned 18, I put her name on the house. I thought, well, this way, if anything ever happened to me, at least she'd have the house. It wasn't a huge place or anything fancy, just your typical 3-bedroom, but it held a lot of memories. I thought this would give her a sense of security, that she'd always have somewhere to call home. That decision made sense back then. Never thought it'd come back to bite me later. Life went on, and eventually Sarah met a guy named Tom. At first he seemed all right, kind of the charming type, and she was over the moon about him. I was just happy to see her so excited. She talked about him nonstop, how he was driven and had these big dreams. But I started noticing that as they got more serious, her attitude started changing a bit. She was less interested in things we used to do together, and every conversation seemed to drift back to how expensive this or luxury that was. But hey, I chalked it up to young love and brushed it off. Then they got married, and I was genuinely happy for her. I thought maybe this was what she needed to settle down, find her own happiness. I didn't mind being on my own. I'd been doing it for years. But it wasn't long after the wedding that things started to feel different. Our regular weekend dinners became less frequent, and the phone calls slowed down. When she did call, it was usually to talk about how they'd gone to some new high-end place or bought something fancy. It was like she was living in a whole other world. After about a year of this, Sarah and Tom invited me over to their place for dinner. Now, this was something special, because they rarely invited me over, and their place was in one of those shiny new upscale neighborhoods. It was nice, sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't quite fit in there. I'm just a retired school teacher, and they're out there in this fancy world where everything seems to be about appearances. The evening was all right. We talked a bit, though it was mostly about things they were buying or vacations they were planning. I tried to bring up little things from our past, memories we shared, but she'd brush it off like they weren't a big deal. By the end of dinner, they started hinting at how they were thinking about upgrading to an even bigger place so they could start a family. I nodded along, thinking it was just casual conversation. I didn't know it back then, but that dinner was the start of a whole load of trouble. A few weeks later, Sarah called out of the blue and started in on this whole thing about family responsibility. She kept saying how she and Tom had been thinking about ways to help out. And that's when she dropped the suggestion that maybe it was time for me to sell the house and downsize. Said it'd be better for everyone, and mentioned how they had a lot on their plates with this big move they were planning. I'll admit, I was thrown off. I'd never once thought about selling the house. This was my home, the place I'd raised Sarah, where Laura and I had started our life together. The idea of just giving it up didn't sit right with me, so I told her plain and simple that I wasn't interested in moving. She paused for a moment, and then just kind of sighed and moved on to another topic, but there was this edge to her voice that didn't sit well. That would have been the end of it for me, but Sarah didn't let it go. Every time she called, there'd be some comment about how the market was really good right now, or how I'd benefit from a smaller place. And every time I'd tell her that I wasn't interested. It was getting irritating, but I figured she'd drop it eventually. But no, instead one day they showed up unannounced. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was sitting on the couch watching one of those old movies Laura and I used to love when I heard the knock. When I opened the door, there they were, looking serious. Tom had a folder in his hand, and Sarah was doing that thing where she'd stare you down like she was trying to make a point without saying a word. They came in, sat me down, and Tom opened the folder to reveal some papers. He started explaining how they'd been thinking things over, and that selling my house would be the perfect solution for everyone involved. He went on about how the market was up, how they'd help me with the sale, and that it'd free me up to move into a manageable place. He said it like he was doing me a favor. I tried to keep my cool, but it was hard. I told them firmly that I was staying put. I didn't want to sell. This was my home, where I'd spent years raising Sarah and where I still felt connected to Laura. But as soon as I said that, Sarah's face changed. She got this look, like she was disappointed in me, as if I was somehow letting her down. They didn't stay long after that, just left with a few muttered words about me not understanding or how I was making things hard. As soon as the door closed behind them, I remember just sitting there, feeling like I'd been hit by something I couldn't even explain. All I knew was that this wasn't the end of it. After that last meeting with Sarah and Tom, I thought they'd finally drop the whole sell the house idea. I'd made myself clear, or so I thought, but a part of me still felt uneasy, like I'd be hearing from them soon. I was right. What came next was more intense and downright sneaky. About a week later, I started getting daily calls from Sarah. She'd start off with small talk, but it wouldn't take long before she'd slide back into the same old conversation about my retirement needs and how a smaller place would suit me better. She'd rattle on about how downsizing was just part of moving on and that I needed to think about the future. My future? I was fine. But she'd keep hinting, almost like she was trying to wear me down. Then, one afternoon, she decided to bring Tom along. They showed up unannounced again, knocking on the door like it was just another family visit. I answered, already bracing myself for whatever new angle they were about to pitch. Sure enough, they came in with the same energy as last time, but this time, Tom was ready to go full sales mode. He had a list of reasons why I should sell, down to the benefits of moving in with them while I still can. They talked as if they were concerned for me, but the way they went on, I could tell their interest wasn't exactly in my well-being. They were all smiles and nods, acting as if they were doing me some big favor by taking me in. And then Tom dropped a new line. "You wouldn't have to worry about upkeep anymore. Imagine a life where you don't have to lift a finger." That's when it hit me. They were framing this whole thing as if I was this frail, helpless person who needed them to survive. They were trying to turn me into a burden that needed taking care of, to make it sound like I needed their help. I held my ground, repeating that I wasn't interested in selling the house. This place was my home, the only home I'd known since Sarah was little. But the moment I said that, the friendly act dropped a bit. Tom sighed, looking at Sarah like I was just being stubborn. Sarah crossed her arms and gave me this look, like she was the one who was disappointed. "Dad, you're not being reasonable," she said, her voice dipping into this serious, almost lecturing tone. "You've done so much on your own, but maybe it's time to let go and let us help." I told them I appreciated the offer but wasn't budging. They stayed a few minutes longer, the whole mood feeling tenser than it had ever been between us. I'll admit, seeing Sarah look at me like I was a burden hurt. But I wasn't about to give in just because they were annoyed with me. They left after a few more forced smiles and polite farewells, but the whole encounter left a bad taste in my mouth. I sat there, replaying it in my head, wondering why Sarah was acting this way. This wasn't the same kid I'd raised, the one who'd stayed up with me after her mom passed, sharing stories and memories to keep Laura's spirit alive. The way she looked at me today, it was like she saw me as some old man who was in the way. It felt wrong, like I was losing her somehow. A few days later, things escalated. I was out front watering the garden when a real estate agent showed up. She came right up to me, clipboard in hand, all smiles, and introduced herself. "Mr. Williams, right? Sarah asked me to come by and discuss some options with you for listing your property. I understand you're looking to sell?" I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't called any real estate agent, hadn't even considered selling. I told her I had no idea what she was talking about, but she just looked confused. "Oh, I must have misunderstood. Sarah made it sound like this was a done deal," she replied, still cheerful but clearly thrown off by my reaction. She handed me her card, mumbled something about contacting her if I changed my mind, and headed back to her car. That night, I called Sarah. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it was time for some clear answers. She picked up, sounding surprised to hear from me. I cut right to the point and asked her why a real estate agent was coming to my house, talking about listing it. There was a long pause before she finally replied, her voice calm but with this strange edge to it. "Dad, we're just trying to help you move forward. It's not like you're going to live there forever, right?" That stung, hearing it put so bluntly. I told her that my future was my decision and that I didn't need her or Tom pushing their plans on me. She sighed, this heavy, almost frustrated sound, and muttered something about being difficult. Then she said something that stuck with me. "Dad, don't make this harder than it has to be." That's when I knew this was more than just a suggestion from them. They were serious about pushing me out. I ended the call quickly, needing some space to just process it all. But Sarah didn't stop. The next week, she started bringing up all these safety concerns whenever we talked. She'd say things like, "Dad, you're getting older, and that house is a lot for you to handle." Or, "Wouldn't it be nice to have someone close by in case something happened?" She started painting this picture of me as a helpless old man, living alone and struggling, like I couldn't manage on my own. It was as if she was trying to create a problem where there wasn't one, just to make her case stronger. One morning, I even caught Tom poking around my garage when he thought I wasn't home. He acted surprised when I walked in and asked what he was doing, claiming he was just checking out some things, but he left in a hurry after that. The whole thing was getting strange and unsettling. I felt like a stranger in my own home, like they were circling around, waiting for me to give in. The worst part, I started feeling paranoid, second-guessing everything. I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder whenever I saw them, wondering if they were plotting something new. I'd never felt that way around Sarah before. She was supposed to be my family, my daughter, but this whole thing was making me question everything. I kept thinking back to when she was younger, remembering the little girl who'd come running to me when she had a bad day, who used to sit with me for hours talking about life and dreams. But now she was looking at me like I was a burden, like I was just in the way. I didn't want to believe that she could be so manipulative, but the signs were there. This wasn't just a casual suggestion anymore. She and Tom had a plan, and I was smack in the middle of it, like some piece on their chessboard. That night, I stayed up, staring at the ceiling, wondering what was going to come next. I wasn't about to back down, but I knew one thing for sure. This fight was far from over. After all the pressure Sarah and Tom had been putting on me to sell the house, I thought things couldn't get worse. I'd made myself pretty clear. I wasn't selling and that was final. But apparently they didn't get the message, or maybe they just didn't care. Because one evening, just as I was starting to think maybe they'd finally backed off, I got a call from Sarah. She didn't waste any time. "Dad, we need to have a serious talk about your living situation," she said, her voice as cold as ice. I could already tell this wasn't going to be a friendly chat, but I agreed to meet with them the next day. I figured maybe, just maybe, they'd finally understand where I was coming from if we talked it out face to face. When they arrived, they came armed. Figuratively, of course. Tom had this folder under his arm, and Sarah was wearing the kind of determined look I'd seen her use when she was dead set on winning an argument. They didn't even sit down before Tom opened the folder, pulled out some papers, and started going off about financial planning, responsibility, and security in my old age. It felt like they were giving me a lecture rather than having a conversation. After a few minutes of this, I'd had enough. I told them flat out that I wasn't going to sell the house and that I was more than capable of managing on my own. That's when Tom, in the most condescending voice possible, said, "Look, we understand this is hard for you to accept, but you're not thinking clearly, Dad." "Not thinking clearly?" I repeated, trying not to blow up right then and there. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were treating me like I was some frail, senile old man who didn't know what was best for himself. I wasn't going to let them bulldoze me, so I told them, once again, that I was staying put. But instead of backing down, Sarah's face twisted into a look I'd never seen before. She leaned forward and said, "If you can't make a smart decision here, then we'll have to do it for you." Her tone was dead serious, like she was actually threatening me. That's when Tom slid a piece of paper across the table, a written offer to sell the house. He explained that they'd already had the property informally appraised and had found buyers interested in making a quick deal. He said that with the current market, we'd be crazy not to sell now. I told him I wasn't interested in selling, no matter what offers they had lined up. Then Sarah dropped the real bomb. "Dad," she said, her voice almost rehearsed, "this isn't just about you. Tom and I have a chance to buy a new home, but we need a bit more for the down payment. You'd be helping us start our family, and in return, you'd have a place to live where you wouldn't be alone." That's when it all clicked. This wasn't about helping me or downsizing for my benefit. They wanted my house to fund their life. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. All that talk about me being alone or struggling with upkeep, it was just fluff to get what they wanted. They wanted to sell my home, pocket the cash, and then stick me in a guest room at their place so they could keep an eye on me. I pushed the offer sheet back toward them and told them, "This is my house, where I raised you, Sarah, where I lived with your mother. I'm not giving it up for your plans." She snapped, and her voice went cold. "Fine, if that's how you feel," she said, crossing her arms. "But just remember, you put me on the deed, so it's my house too. Legally, I have the right to make decisions here." She was leaning into the fact that I'd put her name on the deed all those years ago, back when I thought it would protect her future. I never imagined she'd use it against me like this. I stood up, not wanting to listen to any more of their demands. But Sarah kept talking. Dad, think about it. Do you really want this kind of stress at your age? Moving in with us would take all that pressure off, and you'd be part of our lives. You'd be able to help with your future grandchildren. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were trying to guilt trip me now, dangling the idea of a family in front of me as some sort of prize I'd get if I just did what they wanted. But I was done playing their game. I told them I wasn't selling, that my decision was final, and that if they couldn't accept that, then they could leave. Tom, sensing that they weren't getting anywhere, stood up and gave me this fake sympathetic look. All right, well, think about it, okay? He said, trying to sound all reasonable. But I knew this wasn't over for them. The way they looked at me, I knew they'd be back, and probably with even more pressure. They left, and the house finally felt like mine again, at least for a little while. But I couldn't shake this nagging feeling that this was just the beginning of something worse. I'd seen that look in Sarah's eyes before. She was determined. She'd gotten this way as a teenager when she wanted something, and usually she found a way to get it. Over the next few days, they started calling more often, texting about how unfair it was for me to hoard resources when they needed a home for their family. Sarah even went as far as to say I was being selfish for not supporting her and Tom's future. Selfish. I'd spent my whole life putting her first, doing everything to give her a good life. And now, because I wasn't ready to hand over my house like a prize, I was the selfish one? Then one day, I went to get the mail and saw an envelope from some legal office I didn't recognize. I opened it up to find a letter from a lawyer representing Sarah. It was full of legal terms and warnings about how co-owners must consider the sale of shared property, along with a lot of other garbage I didn't really understand. The point was clear. They were going to try and force my hand. I called a friend of mine who used to work in real estate, and he told me they might be looking into something called partition action, where a co-owner can force the sale of a property if the other owner refuses. Basically, it meant they could take me to court to make me sell my own home. That night, I sat in my living room, just looking around at all the memories in that house. The photos on the wall, the old armchair Laura used to sit in, the shelves lined with books I'd read to Sarah when she was a kid. I felt like everything I'd built over the years, all the love and effort, was being tossed aside by my own daughter. It was clear now that Sarah wasn't going to stop, and neither was Tom. I didn't know what they'd try next, but I knew one thing: I wasn't about to let them bully me out of my own home. The day after I got that legal notice, I was still trying to wrap my head around it all. It was like a nightmare you couldn't wake up from. My own stepdaughter, the kid I raised like she was my own flesh and blood, was coming after me with legal threats. I'd given her everything I could, including a home, and now she wanted to take it right out from under me. It was like the more I said no, the more determined she became to get her way. That morning, I got a call from a friend who'd heard rumors. Apparently, Sarah had been talking around town, telling people that I was struggling to manage on my own, painting this picture of me as some frail, helpless old man. She was telling people I couldn't take care of the house anymore, and that she and Tom were just trying to do what was best for me. I couldn't believe it. Not only was she pushing me to sell, but now she was trying to make me look incompetent. That's when I realized they'd gone into full manipulation mode, pulling every trick in the book to make me look like I couldn't handle myself. But I wasn't about to let them make me a victim in my own life. So I started keeping records. Every message, every call, every time Sarah dropped hints about how I should really think about selling, I wrote it down. If they were going to pull legal tricks, I was going to be ready. A few days later, Sarah and Tom showed up at my door again. This time, they didn't bother with the fake niceties. They came in, barely even saying hello, and got straight to the point. Sarah had this icy look in her eyes, and Tom wasn't far behind, acting like he had it all figured out. He even had another set of papers with him. I figured it was more legal nonsense. "We're here to discuss the sale of the house, Dad," Sarah said, her voice flat and unemotional, like she was reading from a script. "We've lined up an offer, and it's a good one. We don't want to drag this out any longer than it needs to be." I just stared at them. Part of me wanted to laugh, but another part was furious. They were treating this whole thing like it was some business deal, not the home I'd spent my entire life building. I tried to keep calm, but I couldn't help it. "This isn't happening, Sarah. I don't care how many offers you line up. I'm not selling." That's when Tom cut in, and he had this smug look on his face. "You don't have a choice, actually. You're only a co-owner, and we have every right to sell our share. He leaned in, as if he thought he was making some brilliant point. We're being generous by letting you stay here afterward, Dad. You could be out on the street if we weren't so understanding. I could feel my blood boiling. This wasn't some outsider talking to me. This was Tom, the man I'd welcomed into my family. I'd treated him with nothing but respect, and here he was, standing in my own home, practically threatening to kick me out. I told them again that I wasn't interested and that they should leave, but Tom just smirked. You'll have to move eventually, one way or another, he said, almost like he enjoyed seeing me squirm. Why not make this easier on yourself? It was at that moment I realized I was staring down the barrel of a legal battle. They weren't just trying to pressure me. They were going to force me to sell if they had to. The reality hit hard. They didn't care about me, about my life here, or about what this house meant to me. All they saw was a dollar sign. After they left, I sat alone in the living room, thinking about everything. All the years I'd spent building this place, the memories with Laura, raising Sarah, and now it was being reduced to a fight over money. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about dignity, about standing up for myself. I wasn't going to roll over and let them bully me out of my own home. I called my lawyer friend Dean and told him everything. He listened quietly, and when I was done, he said, "We have a fight on our hands, but don't worry, we're going to make sure they don't walk all over you." Hearing him say that gave me a sense of relief. Dean wasn't just my lawyer. He was someone who knew me, who knew what I'd gone through to build my life. He wasn't going to let them push me around. The next day, Dean filed a motion to prevent the sale of the house without my consent. And that's when things really started to heat up. Sarah and Tom found out pretty quick, and, as you can guess, they weren't happy. I got a call from Sarah, who sounded almost frantic, like she couldn't believe I was actually standing up to them. "Dad, why are you doing this?" she demanded. "We're only trying to help you, and you're making everything harder." "Help me?" I replied, unable to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. "How is trying to force me out of my home helping me, Sarah?" She went quiet, probably not expecting me to throw her own words back at her. But then, she started in on the guilt trips. She said that Tom and she needed the money to start their life together, that I was being selfish by holding on to a house that I didn't even need. She made it sound like I was some greedy old man clinging to his possessions instead of a father trying to protect his home. I told her I'd heard enough and hung up. I wasn't going to let her twist this around. I knew what they were doing, and I wasn't falling for it. Over the next few days, they kept calling, trying different tactics each time. Sometimes they'd act hurt. Sometimes they'd be downright nasty. It was like they couldn't decide whether to manipulate me with kindness or intimidate me with threats. Then one afternoon, I noticed a for sale sign staked into my front yard. I was furious. I stormed out there, ripped it out, and threw it in the trash. But it didn't end there. Sarah and Tom started coming over with realtors, acting like they had every right to show people around my house. They walked potential buyers through the place as if I wasn't even there, like I was invisible. I remember standing in the hallway one time, watching a family walk through the rooms, admiring the layout, the backyard, the living room. It felt surreal, like I was watching strangers pick apart my life piece by piece. I couldn't stand it. I told them all to get out, that this was my home and I wasn't selling, but Sarah just rolled her eyes and told me I was being unreasonable. Tom, meanwhile, looked at me like I was an obstacle, something he just needed to get rid of. After they left, I felt drained, like they'd taken some part of me with them. At that point, I realized this wasn't just a disagreement anymore. They were set on taking this house no matter what it took. But I wasn't going down without a fight. I'd raised Sarah, given her everything, and if she thought she could just waltz in here and take what was mine, she had another thing coming. This was my home, and I was prepared to do whatever it took to keep it. Last update. After everything Sarah and Tom had pulled to try and force me out of my home, it finally reached the point where we were facing each other in court. They'd thrown every trick they could think of to break me down, slapping a for sale sign on my yard, showing my house to strangers, parading around town claiming I was too old and incompetent to manage my own affairs. They thought they'd cornered me, but I wasn't about to give up without a fight. When the court day came, they walked in like they'd already won. Tom had on his smug grin, and Sarah wouldn't even look me in the eye. Their high-priced lawyer, looking way too polished, was all set to argue that they were simply acting in my best interest and helping a struggling family member transition to a more suitable living arrangement. It was twisted, the way they'd warped everything to make it sound like they were doing me a favor. But they'd underestimated just how much I'd prepared. Dean, my lawyer, had spent countless hours with me, gathering every message, call log, and piece of evidence I could provide. He'd helped me put together a full record of their harassment, the texts from Sarah saying I was being selfish, The real estate listings I'd caught online without my consent, the photos I'd taken of them touring strangers through my home, and the affidavits from neighbors who'd seen how they'd tried to paint me as a feeble old man who couldn't manage on his own. When it was my turn to present, Dean laid out everything. He began by showing that Sarah and Tom's concern for my well-being was nothing but a cover-up for their own greed. He read aloud some of Sarah's messages, particularly the ones where she'd blatantly guilt-tripped me about helping them start a family and giving up on the past. The judge's face didn't show much at first, but I could tell he was paying close attention. Then Dean went on to talk about their unauthorized open houses. He showed photos of strangers they'd brought into my home without my permission. People who'd wandered through the rooms I'd lived in for decades as if they were walking through an empty showroom. Dean argued that this wasn't just disrespectful, it was a blatant invasion of my privacy. At that point, the judge's brow furrowed, and Sarah looked down, clearly uncomfortable. Tom, on the other hand, kept glancing at his lawyer, as if he thought he'd find some way out of this mess. But the real turning point came when Dean brought up the legal notice they'd filed. He pointed out that Sarah and Tom had gone as far as pursuing a partition action to force the sale of the home, essentially trying to strip me of my rights as a co-owner without even attempting to find a compromise. Dean highlighted that this move wasn't about my well-being or helping me downsize for my own good, as they claimed. No, this was a calculated attempt to liquidate the property so they could cash in on it, regardless of my wishes. The judge looked over the evidence carefully, and as the hearing went on, I could see his expression start to change. It was like he could finally see through their thin excuses, and the reality of their intentions was all laid out for everyone to see. By the end of it, it was clear they'd crossed lines. They weren't just acting out of concern for me, they were manipulating the situation for personal gain, and they were ruthless about it. In his ruling, the judge stated plainly that Sarah and Tom's actions were a clear violation of my rights as a co-owner and primary resident. He said that their tactics were coercive and without genuine concern for my well-being, and that their unauthorized actions showed a lack of respect for my autonomy and privacy. He ruled firmly in my favor, upholding my right to remain in my home without interference from either of them. On top of that, he ordered them to cover my legal fees, noting that their harassment had been intentional and abusive. The moment that judgment was delivered, I could see the shock on their faces. Sarah looked like she'd been slapped, and Tom's smug grin vanished. He looked furious, his face going red as he realized his big plan had just blown up in his face. Their lawyer scrambled to save face, but it was too late. The judge's decision was final, and they'd lost. After that, things went downhill for them fast. It didn't take long for Tom's real colors to show. He had been banking on getting a big payout from my house, probably dreaming of a shiny new home in an upscale neighborhood. But with the court ruling against them, that dream was dead, and Tom was livid. I heard from mutual friends that he wasn't handling it well at all. He was angry, blaming Sarah for the whole mess, saying she should have found a way to make it work. A few weeks later, I found out that Tom had filed for divorce. He'd packed up his things and left, leaving Sarah on her own. Without the promise of a big payout, he had no interest in staying. Apparently, the reality of not getting his hands on my house, and the money he'd been counting on, was enough for him to call it quits. Sarah's dream life had crumbled before her eyes, all because she and Tom had tried to take something that didn't belong to them. Then, one evening, not long after I'd heard about their split, I got a knock on my door. I opened it to find Sarah standing there, looking like a shadow of the person I'd raised. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying, and her shoulders were slumped like she'd just lost everything. She looked up at me, barely able to hold my gaze. "Dad, I messed up," she whispered. "I don't know what I was thinking. I lost everything. Tom, the house, everything. I just wanted to come home." For a second, I didn't know what to say. This was the same girl I'd once stayed up all night with, the same girl I'd raised and tried to protect all those years. And yet she'd tried to throw me out of my own home. She'd looked at me like I was just an obstacle to her dream life. And now here she was, standing on my doorstep, asking for a second chance. I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of sadness and resolve. "Sarah, I'm sorry for everything you're going through, but you brought this on yourself. I gave you a home, a family, and all you wanted was to take it for yourself. You didn't think twice about what it would cost me." She started to cry, reaching out like she was going to hug me, but I took a step back. "I think it's time you find your own way, Sarah. You made your choices. Now it's time to live with them." I closed the door gently, but firmly, watching as she stood there, her face crumpling as reality sank in. It wasn't easy to do, but I knew it was the right decision. She needed to understand that actions have consequences, and that trust isn't something you can just toss around whenever it's convenient. As I turned back into my home, I felt a strange sense of peace. I still had my house, my memories, and my dignity. And while I would always care for Sarah in some way, I knew I'd done the right thing. This was my home, and I wasn't about to let anyone take that from me, no matter who they were.